What if the truth of cinema was never written into the scripts, but hidden inside the frames that studios sliced away before anyone could see them? Across decades of filmmaking, certain stories drifted too close to the edge, too real, too unfiltered, too willing to show the parts of violence, war, and desperation that Hollywood preferred to soften. These films didn't just entertain, they exposed nerves. And whenever a film exposes too much, someone always reaches for the scissors. It happened in the underground chaos of the mid-2000s, where a frantic crime thriller revealed a world that felt a little too possible. It happened in the 2010s, when a patriotic war picture was shaped and reshaped until the truth blurred into propaganda. It happened throughout the 80s, in fever dream nightmares of trauma in siege stories, banned in half the world, and in a forgotten tale of a soldier who claimed an entire park just to be heard. Different decades, different directors. But all of them faced the same quiet resistance, a truth considered too heavy for mainstream screens. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1. Running Scared. 2006. The cut they tried to bury in the noise of its chaos. In 2006, Wayne Kramer released a feverish crime thriller that looked at first glance like another gritty chase film. Starring Paul Walker at his most unpolished Running Scared, carved a neon path through the underbelly of a nameless city, shot with frantic handheld energy and smothered in a palette so cold it felt bruised. It arrived during a period where studios were polishing crime films until they gleamed, but this movie refused to shine. It bared its teeth instead. On the surface, audiences were told to expect a stylish, hyper-violent ride, something wild, exaggerated, and detached from reality. The marketing promised adrenaline, not discomfort. The studio leaned into the chaos, selling it like a roller coaster, hoping the spectacle would overshadow the film's raw emotional undercurrent about loyalty exploitation and the price of survival. But underneath that surface was a version too bleak for the studio to stomach. Early cuts of the film reportedly pushed further into the psychological darkness of its characters, revealing scenes that blurred the line between fantasy stylization and grim authenticity. Several sequences, particularly those involving abuse trauma and the corrupt machinery of crime, were softened or reshaped before release. The violence wasn't just trimmed for rating reasons, it was pulled back to prevent the film from feeling uncomfortably real. Kramer's original vision leaned into the ugliness of the world he created, but the released version carried the fingerprints of those who wanted the edges dulled. What survived was intense but not as confrontational as intended. By the time the credits rolled, the movie left a strange question behind when a story is too sharp. How much truth has to be shaved away before it becomes safe enough to show? Film 2. Act of Valor, 2012. The propaganda they called a movie, and the movie they called the truth. When Act of Valor arrived in 2012, it didn't look like any action film of its time. Shot with a blend of digital sharpness and documentary grit, it placed real Navy SEALs at the center of its story. Men whose faces were lit not by Hollywood ambition, but by the weight of operations they had actually lived through. Directed by Mike McCoy and Scott Waugh, the film was presented as a tribute, a window into the lives and sacrifices of elite soldiers. But even from its first frame, something felt unusual, as if the line between filmmaking and recruitment was dissolving. Its surface story was simple, even patriotic. Audiences were told they were watching authenticity, a rare glimpse behind the secrecy of elite warfare. The action was marketed as real, the emotions as unfiltered harmful, and the experience as a cinematic salute to heroism. Posters and trailers framed it as a once-in-a-generation experiment where reality replaced acting and truth replaced script. But behind that polished narrative was a tightly controlled production shaped by forces far larger than any director. The Department of Defense had unprecedented influence over the script the missions depicted, and even the characters' emotional arcs. Scenes were rewritten to align with military messaging. Entire sequences showing operational ambiguity were removed, and moments that hinted at psychological strain were softened or excised. What could have been a difficult meditation on the cost of duty became something weighed, filtered, and adjusted until only the safest version of truth remained. The film didn't just portray soldiers. It served a purpose beyond storytelling, blurring the boundary between cinema and persuasion. By the end, one question lingered when authenticity is curated. Does the truth still belong to the filmmakers, or to the people who decide what the world is allowed to see? Film 3, Combat Shock, 1984. The nightmare they tried to shrink before it could speak. In 1984, a small independent film emerged from the margins of New York's underground scene. A film so bleak, so unfiltered, that it felt less like cinema and more like a confession. Directed by Buddy Giovinazzo, Combat Shock followed the fractured life of a Vietnam veteran, haunted not by memories, but by the residue of a war that refused to let him return home. It was shot on a shoestring budget, using crumbling streets, fluorescent decay, and the exhausted faces of real neighborhoods to give shape to a story Hollywood had never dared to tell so plainly. On the surface, the film was marketed as another exploitation feature, the kind of gritty shocker that late-night audiences expected from grindhouse theaters. Posters leaned into extremity, suggesting chaos and spectacle, rather than the slow, suffocating despair the movie truly explored. The distributors packaged it like a violent B-movie, hoping to attract viewers with the promise of outrageousness, rather than the quiet tragedy at its core. But beneath that surface was a version far more disturbing, a cut that the studio believed was too grim, too honest, and too emotionally corrosive for public release. The original edit, titled American Nightmare, lingered longer on the character's unraveling, refusing to soften his isolation or his psychological collapse. Several scenes depicting the raw weight of trauma were trimmed or shortened, not because of graphic content alone, but because of tone. It was a film that dared to show what happened after the war ended, long after the parade stopped and the cameras turned away. And that honesty was considered dangerous. What remained on screen still carried the sting of truth. But the shadows hinted at something even heavier, a version of America that existed between the cracks, unseen and unresolved. In the silence left by the missing footage, one realization lingered. Some battles don't end. They simply stop being filmed. Film 4 Siege, 1983. The film that spread too much fear to be left in one piece. In 1983, during a tense moment in North American social history, a small Canadian thriller tried to show a version of urban violence that felt uncomfortably real. Titled Siege, directed by Paul Donovan. It followed ordinary people trapped inside a building, while a rogue group turned the streets outside into a battleground. Shot with raw immediacy and lit like a documentary gone wrong, the film captured the claustrophobia and panic of a society that seemed ready to snap. It was low budget, but it pulsed with the urgency of something more dangerous than its price tag suggested. On its surface, the film was marketed as an intense home invasion thriller, the kind of underground action picture meant to satisfy audiences hungry for adrenaline. Posters emphasized the danger, the guns, the tension, framing it as a simple tale of survival against faceless attackers. It was promoted as a piece of genre entertainment, loud, fast, and brutal, but ultimately contained. Yet beneath that facade was a story that several countries found too sensitive to release without intervention. The antagonists in Siege were not vague criminals, but extremist figures whose ideology mirrored real events occurring at the time. As political tension rose in parts of Europe and North America, the film's depiction of vigilantism and targeted violence became more than a narrative choice. It became a statement. Certain distributors demanded cuts. Some markets banned it outright. Other regions quietly shelved the movie, claiming it was too provocative for public consumption. Scenes portraying the fear and helplessness of marginalized characters were especially scrutinized, as if the truth they illustrated cut deeper than expected. By the time audiences eventually found the film through bootlegs and late-night broadcasts, the shadows of censorship still clung to it, and it left behind an unsettling question. When a story echoes reality too closely, does it become a warning or a threat to those who would rather pretend the danger isn't there? Film 5, The Park Is Mine, 1986. The war that followed him home until the city became his last battlefield. In 1986, The Park Is Mine arrived quietly, almost anonymously, as a made-for-TV film starring Tommy Lee Jones at a time when he was still shaping his on-screen identity. At first glance, the story seemed straightforward. A Vietnam veteran, pushed past the point of silence, decides to seize Central Park and force the world to hear what it had ignored. But beneath the surface, the film carried the bruised heartbeat of an era that Hollywood often preferred to sanitize. Shot through muted colors and long, lonely frames, it captured the feeling of a man trapped between the past and a city that had moved on without him. On the surface, it was promoted as a tense action drama, a one-man army spectacle set against one of America's most recognizable landscapes. Audiences were told to expect explosions, standoffs, and tactical maneuvers. Network marketing pitched it as entertainment, rather than a meditation on the invisible wounds left by war. The film was framed as a curiosity, a TV event meant to fill a time slot, rather than echo a generation's unresolved ache. But behind that simplified presentation was a more uncomfortable truth. The original script explored far deeper psychological fractures, portraying the protagonist not as a lone warrior, but as the broken remnant of a conflict the nation refused to confront. Several scenes highlighting institutional neglect, post-war abandonment, and the emotional collapse of veterans were trimmed or softened to meet television standards. The network avoided anything that suggested political weight or criticism, reshaping the story into something safer, quieter, easier to digest. What could have been a raw critique of forgotten soldiers became a restrained version of itself, confined by the medium that carried it. When the film faded into obscurity, it left a haunting realization lingering beneath the rewrites. Some soldiers never lose the battlefield. The world simply stops watching their war. Bonus fact: the film that never survived its own truth. Long before streaming resurrected forgotten cinema, there was a war film so fractured by interference that almost no one has seen the version its director intended. It was a project conceived in the late 80s, built around the diaries of soldiers whose stories never reached the public. The production began with ambition, a gritty, unromantic portrait of a platoon unraveling far from home, told through the eyes of men who understood the cost of silence. Yet from the moment cameras rolled, the film became a battleground of its own. The studio expected something heroic and easily marketable. Investors wanted clarity patriotism, a story that aligned neatly with the image of triumph. But the script told a different truth, one filled with doubt, moral exhaustion, and the kind of emotional turbulence that challenged national narratives. Early test screenings left executives unsettled. The characters were too human, the battles too disorienting, and the aftermath too honest. Instead of reshoots, they ordered something more drastic, a complete re-edit that stripped away the heart of the story. Scenes involving disillusionment vanished. Monologues were cut mid-thought. The cinematography, once haunting and slow, was rearranged to resemble a conventional action film. When the watered-down version premiered, audiences sensed the emptiness behind the explosions. Critics dismissed it, unaware that the film they reviewed was only a shadow of what once existed. The original cut, whispered about, but never released, faded into myth. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous truths aren't the ones shown on screen, but the ones removed before they ever reach the light. Some films fail on screen. Others were never even allowed to fail. Across these 5 films, the screen becomes something more than a surface for spectacle. It becomes a mirror catching the fragments of truths that slipped through the cracks of studio control and public expectation. Each story, in its own way, reflects the tension between what filmmakers try to say and what the industry allows them to show. A frantic chase through the underbelly of crime, a military narrative shaped by unseen hands, a veteran's descent into a world that no longer hears him, a siege that echoed the fears of its era, and a soldier claiming a city park just to feel visible again together. They reveal a pattern as old as cinema itself. When a film edges too close to reality, someone always decides how much of that reality audiences are permitted to witness. These movies remind us that the battle over a story doesn't end when filming wraps. It continues in the editing room, in the hands of executives in the quiet meetings, where decisions are made about tone, message, and what truths can safely survive. And as viewers, we inherit what remains the version allowed to reach us, the version considered acceptable. So the question lingers long after the credits fade. Which of these films do you believe revealed too much, and which one deserved to be seen uncensored? In a world where every frame can be a confession, what truth do you think was cut away before it ever reached the light? Real secrets, where the truth was always in the edit.